On nous a appris que l'argent qui revient des diasporas africaines partout dans le monde sont plus, je crois même 10 fois ou plus forts que l'argent que nous venons des aides. Alors il faut qu'on capitalise sur ça d'une manière ou d'une autre. Right Honorable Odinga, I think you are the special envoy for infrastructure. We have a joke where I work that even if you have the greatest broadband network, often you run into a bad road network when you're trying to move goods across countries. I know that you are working on the question of infrastructure, and one of the special projects of the Agenda 2063 is the high-speed train network. So can you tell us a little bit about that? It's a kind of a Wakanda-style dream for the moment, but what's happening to make it come to life?
Thank you very much. I want to begin also by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting us to come here. Secondly, I want to congratulate President Paul Kagame for the inspirational role that he's been playing on this continent. And also for challenging Africans. I remember recently he said that Africans should own their problems, seek solutions to those problems, and write their own stories. And I couldn't agree more with him. Because as this old saying goes, until the lion learns to write, the story of the hunt will always favor the hunter. So the African lion needs to write its own story. And this is very crucial. The founding fathers of the African continent really wanted African unity. Remember, Kwame Nkrumah said that Africa will not be free until every inch of the continent is liberated. And a lot was spent in the struggle for the total liberation of the African continent. At that time also they were talking about the African unity. But of course, over 50 years later, we are still here where we are. We are still with the colonial boundaries that were drawn in Berlin, where no African was represented. But that's a challenge and a subject for another day. But now, it is here in Kigali where the African leaders came as a result of realization that Africa was really treading very late with itself, and that there is need to break some of these barriers and facilitate more intra-African trade. This again was inspired by President Paul Kagame. Now, but how does Africa trade with itself? One of the impediments is lack of proper infrastructure. And I usually give the example of Kenya on East Africa and Central African Republic. It's only a stone's throw away from Kenya. Only South Sudan is between Kenya and Central African Republic. But how do Kenyan goods reach there? To export Kenyan coffee to Bangi, you need a ship that will go around the Cape and up the western coast, up to Cameroonian port of Douala or Kribi, and then by road all the way back to Bangi. The French are there much earlier than you. And that's why they are drinking Kenyan coffee there, christened as Nescafe. Or they drink Kenyan tea there, known as English breakfast tea. So, lack of infrastructure. And that is why the African Union, through the agency of NEPAD, came up with the infrastructure development that will link Africa. And here we have not only the high-speed railway that you're talking about, but we have first the continental highways. And then we're also talking about the waterways. And then you're talking about the open skies, the air transport in the continent. And finally, the high-speed railway network. Right now, we have about 9 intercontinental trans-African highways that have been identified for development. The Cape to Cairo, the Tripoli to the Cape, Dakar, Cairo to Dakar, Dakar to Lagos, Dakar, N'Djamena, then N'Djamena to Djibouti, Lagos to Mombasa, to mention just some of them. And then there is, of course, the continental high-speed railway network, which will help the transportation of goods across the continent. Because right now, the cost of transport within the continent of Africa is between 50 to 175% higher than the rest of the world. And that's what makes it very difficult for intra-African trade. So these railway networks have been conceived to link the continents. You have one running from Lagos through Kano, eventually going to N'Djamena in Chad. One would run from Beira, port coming through Harare into Lusaka, along Benguela line to Huambo in Angola. Then we have got the Trans-African Beltway, which runs from the port of Lamu in Kenya, branching to one to Addis Ababa, and the other one to Juba in South Sudan. And from there, that's phase 1. Phase 2 going from Juba through Bangui in Central African Republic to Yaoundé up to the Cameroonian port of Kribi, creating a land bridge linking the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and opening the interior of the continent to trade. Several landlocked countries then will be able to hook on. Chad can hook on, Uganda, DRC, the Republic of Congo, of course Nigeria, and so on. So you can have goods coming from east to west and west to east. So all the imports coming from Europe will come and be to the Cameroonian port of Kribi, and then will be then transported across the continent. And those coming from Asia, from Japan, China, and so on, come to the port of Lamu and transported across the continent. That way, it will be easier for imports and also intra-African trade. Ethiopia has just completed a railway line from Djibouti to Addis Ababa. She will connect with Lapset all the way to the port of Lamu in Kenya. But then, another issue here is how do you construct the high-speed railway line without power, energy? And that is why we are now also talking about energy across the continent. And that is how the Inga Dam in DRC becomes a priority in the continent. The Inga is has got the biggest hydroelectric potential in the world. Right now, the studies show that you can generate up to 110,000 megawatts from Inga. The DRC's requirement will be 10,000, at most 20,000. So therefore, it cannot be a national project. It must be developed as a regional, a continental project. And that's why we're saying that this is a major priority that we want to take off almost immediately. There are regional power pools. The Southern African power pool, the Eastern African power pool, the Central African, the Western African, and Northern African. We are now talking about regional interconnections so that you can then interconnect the entire continent and have this energy distributed and available at a much cheaper rate. Some countries, like in Liberia, the cost of energy is about 35 cents per unit. You cannot hope to develop in that kind of rate of power. So you need to find a way where you can get cheap power. This will enable Africa also to add value, to value addition to raw materials that's abundant on this continent. Africa, the richest continent in terms of resources, yet Africans' living conditions are also the poorest. This paradox is what we want to resolve, so that instead of exporting iron ore, we'll be exporting steel. Instead of exporting copper, we'll be exporting copper cables. Instead of exporting bauxite, we'll be exporting aluminum, finished goods, or sheets, or channels. Most of the raw materials will leave this continent as processed products, and thus will create jobs for the millions of the African youth who are impatient right now, are unemployed.
Thank you.
We want the African land to roar, and ensure this is the time for the African land to give a message to the Asian tiger. Thank you.
I think the question that's difficult to answer here is...
Et en vos rêves.
Thank you. Right Honorable Odinga?
Well, the Americans went to the moon a long time ago. I think in the next 60 years, Africa should not be thinking about the Mars. We should be thinking of going to the other galaxy rather than this one that we will have conquered. I believe that we want to move towards uniting Africa in 60 years. First begin with regional integration, not just economically, but political integration, uniting these countries, removing these unnecessary barriers. Here now, today we are in Kigali, we are using franc. In Kinshasa again, we are using franc. In Uganda, there's Uganda shilling, Tanzania shilling, Kenya shilling. Before the British left, there was only one East African shilling. But the French and the Belgians abandoned the franc and went to the euro. Yet now euro is still now in Rwanda and in DRC and the CFAC. We want to really unite these countries politically and economically. Finally, I mentioned about the African lion, and I want to conclude with my story about the African lion. And the African lion is talking and challenging the Asian tiger 60 years from this century, and saying that I am the African lion. I have been asleep in the forest of the Congo, and you have danced for too long alone on the stage. The European bear retreated to the poles long time ago. The American panda is on the retreat. But I am now awake as the African lion. I am bounded by the mighty Kilimanjaro to the east and Mount Kenya, the Atlas Mountains to the west, the Congo River in the middle, the Nile, the Niger, the Zambezi, the Limpopo, and I am sitting on the African gold, African bauxite, African copper, African diamonds, and I am African oil. And I have the knowledge and capacity to transform all this wealth into better living standards for my people of Africa and claim the 21st century as truly African century. Thank you.
Thank you. Votre Excellence Moussa Faki, 30 secondes sur what will happen in the next 60 years.